Pacific Ocean, 2,000 miles west of the Galapagos Islands, holds a particular kind of silence. It is not the silence of absence, but of scale. The water moves in long, rolling swells that travel for hundreds of miles without interruption. The sky is wide and empty. There are no birds this far out, no land, no reference point except the sun's arc and the stars that emerge each night in rotating patterns. In November of 1820, this region of the ocean was known to whalemen as productive hunting ground. Sperm whales move through these waters in pods, feeding on squid in the deep channels where the ocean floor drops away into darkness. The whales surface and breathe, their blows visible for miles in clear weather. Ships came here for oil, dense, valuable oil rendered from blubber and stored in barrels below decks. The work was systematic. A lookout station at the masthead scanned the horizon. When whales were sighted, boats were lowered. Men rowed toward the pod, harpoons ready. If the strike was good, the whale would run, towing the boat in what whalemen call a Nantucket sleigh ride. Eventually the animal would tire. It would be lanced. It would die. The carcass would be towed back to the ship and processed. This was industry. It was dangerous, but it was understood. Men died from capsized boats, from lines that wrapped around limbs, from whales that fought back. But ships did not sink. Ships were the constant. They were shelter, supply, and navigation. They were the only solid thing in all that water. On the morning of November 20th, 1820, the whale ship Essex was under reduced sail, drifting in light wind. The crew had spotted whales. 3 boats had been lowered and were pulling away from the ship, oars working in rhythm. The men left aboard the Essex, a skeleton crew, prepared to receive the catch. The ocean was calm. The day was ordinary. The Essex was built in 1799 in Massachusetts, a working vessel designed for the North Atlantic whale fishery. She measured 87 feet in length, displaced 238 tons, and had been refitted multiple times over 2 decades of service. By 1820, she was not a new ship, but she was sound. Her hull was reinforced. Her rigging was maintained. She had completed multiple voyages and returned each time with her hold full of oil. She sailed out of Nantucket, an island off the coast of Massachusetts that had built its economy entirely on whaling. Nantucket men grew up with the sea. They learned navigation, rope work, and boat handling as children. By adolescence, many had signed on to cruise. Whaling was not romantic work. It was labor, hot, bloody, and slow. A voyage could last 2 to 3 years. Men left wives and families behind. Some never returned. The Essex departed Nantucket on August 12, 1819, under the command of Captain George Pollard Jr. Pollard was 29 years old, newly promoted to captain. This was his first voyage in command, though he had sailed as a mate on prior trips. He was competent, cautious, and respected, though not widely known for bold decision-making. His first mate was Owen Chase, 23 years old, also from Nantucket. Chase was more aggressive in temperament, quick to act, confident in his seamanship. He had proven himself capable on prior voyages and was expected to command his own ship within a few years. He kept a journal, a practice common among officers. The second mate was Matthew Joy, older than both Pollard and Chase, a veteran whaleman with years of experience. He was steady, quiet, and reliable. The rest of the crew consisted of 18 men, a mix of experienced sailors, green hands on their first voyage, and a cabin boy named Thomas Nickerson, just 14 years old when the voyage began. The ship's mission was straightforward. Hunt sperm whales, render their blubber into oil, fill the hold, and return to Nantucket. Sperm oil burned cleanly and was used in lamps across America and Europe. It was valuable. A successful voyage could make a captain and his investors wealthy. Crew members worked on shares, no wages, only a percentage of profit. A good voyage meant a year's income. A poor one meant debt. By November 1820, the Essex had been at sea for nearly 15 months. She had rounded Cape Horn, hunted in the Pacific waters off the coast of Chile, and continued west into open ocean. The hold was half full. The crew was healthy. There had been no major incidents, no storm severe enough to damage the ship, no deaths. The voyage was proceeding as planned. The Essex was far from any shipping lane. far from any island, alone in a region of ocean where ships appeared only rarely. The nearest land was over 1,000 miles in any direction. This isolation was normal. Whalemen expected it. They carried enough provisions to last months. Salt pork, hardtack, flour, water, and wooden casks. As long as the ship remained intact, they were safe. On the morning of November 20th, the crew had been working for hours. The lookout had called out whales just after dawn. The boats had been lowered. Captain Pollard, Owen Chase, and Matthew Joy each commanded a boat with a crew of 6 men. The boats pulled away from the ship, chasing the pod across open water. The Essex drifted, waiting. The 3 whaleboats spread out across the water, each crew rowing toward a different whale. The animals had surfaced to breathe, and then sounded, diving deep. The men waited, oars resting, watching for the next blow. Sperm whales could remain submerged for over an hour. Patience was part of the work. Owen Chase's boat was the first to strike. A whale surfaced near them. The boat closed the distance. The harpooner stood the bow and drove the iron into the whale's flank. The line ran out fast, smoking against the wooden cleat as the whale dove. The boat lurched forward, pulled by the animal's flight. This was expected. The men braced themselves and let the whale run. But something went wrong. The whale turned sharply and came up beneath the boat, smashing into it with its head. The plank splintered. Water poured in. The men scrambled to bail and plug the damage, but the boat was taking on too much water. Chase cut the line to free the whale. The crew rowed back toward the Essex, the boat riding low, barely afloat. They reached the ship and pulled alongside. The boat was hauled up and laid across the deck for repairs. Chase and his men began assessing the damage: nails, planks, tar. It would take time, but it was manageable. This kind of thing happened. Boats were stove, and occasionally they were repaired. The hunt continued. Chase was standing on the deck, working on the boat, when one of the crew shouted. He looked up. A large sperm whale, perhaps 85 feet in length, had surfaced roughly 100 yards off the bow. It was lying still on the surface, facing the ship. Chase watched it. The whale did not move. It simply floated there, head toward them, motionless in the water. Then it began to swim, directly at the ship. Chase shouted a warning. Men on deck stopped what they were doing and turned to look. The whale was moving fast now, faster than seemed possible for an animal that size. Its head cut through the water in a straight line toward the Essex. It struck the bow head-on. The impact shuddered through the entire length of the ship. Men were thrown off their feet. The hull groaned. The whale had hit just forward the forechains, driving into the oak planking with the full force of its weight and speed. Chase grabbed the rail and steadied himself. The ship had stopped moving. The whale had stopped her dead. For a moment, there was silence. Then the whale surfaced again, 20 yards off the port side. It was thrashing now, disoriented, its jaw working. Chase could see damage to the whale's head. It appeared stunned. Then it turned again, and it came back. This time it struck with even greater force, hitting the ship just beneath the waterline near the bow. The sound was enormous, a deep, splintering crack that echoed across the water. The Essex shook violently. Men shouted. The whale pulled away and disappeared beneath the surface, leaving the ship rocking in its wake. Chase ran below to inspect the damage. Water was pouring in through the shattered planks. The bow compartment was already flooding. He returned to the deck and reported to men still aboard. The ship was holed. Badly. They tried to pump. 2 men worked the bilge pump, while others attempted to rig a sail over the damaged section of the hull to slow the flooding, a technique called frothering. But the water was coming in too fast. The bow was settling. The Essex was tilting forward, her stern rising slowly out of the water. Chase ordered distress signals. A flag was raised upside down. Out on the water, Captain Pollard and Matthew Joy saw it. They cut their lines and began rowing back toward the ship. By the time they arrived, the Essex was listing severely. Her bow was submerged. The deck was slanting. Barrels and equipment were sliding toward the forward rail. Pollard came aboard and assessed the situation immediately. There was no saving the ship. She was going down. The order was given: abandon ship. Salvage what you can. The crew worked quickly. There was no panic, but there was urgency. The Essex was sinking slowly, which gave them time, perhaps an hour, maybe two. The stern was rising higher as the bow continued to settle. Water crept steadily up the deck. Everything that could be saved had to be pulled from the ship now. The 3 whaleboats were still intact. They were secured and prepared for loading. Each boat measured roughly 25 feet in length, narrow and open, designed for speed and maneuverability during the hunt. They were not built for long-term occupation. They had no cover, no shelter from sun or rain, but they would float and they would carry men. Captain Pollard directed the salvage operation. The crew broke into hold in the storage compartments, hauling up whatever provisions they could reach. Casks of water were rolled across the tilting deck and lowered carefully into the boats. Hardtack, dense, unleavened biscuits baked to last months at sea, was packed into containers and passed down. Salted pork, some damaged by seawater, was loaded. Navigation instruments were retrieved. 2 sextants, a compass, charts. Muskets were brought up. A small amount of gunpowder, rope, sailcloth, nails. They worked without speaking much. The ship groaned beneath them as the timbers bent and cracked under the strain. The masts were still standing, but the angle was wrong. The Essex no longer looked like a ship. She looked like a wreck. By mid-afternoon, the boats were loaded. Pollard made a final count. 21 men, 3 boats. 7 men to each boat. Captain Pollard would take one. Owen Chase would command the second. Matthew Joy the third. The boats were provisioned as evenly as possible, though supplies were limited. In total, they had approximately 600 pounds of hardtack and 200 gallons of water. For 21 men in open ocean with no land in sight, they pushed off in the Essex and rowed a short distance away. Then they stopped and waited. The men sat in the boats, oars resting, and watched the ship die. The stern rose higher. The bow disappeared beneath the surface. The mast tilted forward at an extreme angle, rigging trailing in the water. Then, slowly, the Essex slipped under. She went down bow first, the stern the last part to vanish. There was no explosion, no dramatic collapse, just a slow descent into the Pacific. A few barrels and pieces of debris floated to the surface. Then nothing. The men sat in silence. Around them, the ocean stretched in every direction, unbroken. There was no smoke on the horizon, no other sail, no island. They were alone. Captain Pollard called the boats together. The question now was immediate and unavoidable. Where do we go? Their position was approximately 0 degrees 40 minutes south latitude, 119 degrees west longitude, far off the coast of South America, deep in the central Pacific. The nearest known land was the Marquesas Islands, roughly 1,200 miles to the southwest. But there was a problem. The Marquesas were believed by many whalemen to be inhabited by hostile islanders. Reports, some accurate, some exaggerated, spoke of violence against shipwrecked sailors, of cannibalism. Whether these reports were true or not, the fear was real. The Society Islands were another option, farther west, but the same concerns applied. Pollard and his officers feared landing on an unknown Pacific island more than they feared the open ocean. The alternative was to sail east toward the coast of South America, Chile or Peru. The distance was immense, between 2,500 and 3,000 miles, depending on their course. It would take months, but it was known territory. Ships passed along that coast. Ports existed. It was civilization. The men discussed it briefly. There was little debate. Fear of the islands outweighed the difficulty of the passage. They would sail east. The 3 boats were rigged with small sails. The wind was light, but favorable. They set a course and began to move. Behind them, the site where the Essex had gone down was already indistinguishable from the rest of the ocean. There was no marker, no wreckage visible, just water. Each man was rationed. Captain Pollard established the system on the first day. 3 ounces of hardtack per day, half a pint of water, nothing more. The math was simple. With the supplies they had, carefully managed, they could survive perhaps 60 days, maybe longer if they stretched it. 60 days to cover 3,000 miles. They rowed when the wind died. They sailed when it blew. The boats stayed together, within hailing distance of one another. At night, They lashed the boats side by side to prevent separation in the dark. The men took turns sleeping, though sleep was difficult. The boats rocked constantly. There was no room to stretch out. Bodies pressed against one another. Everything was damp. The first week passed slowly. The sun was relentless during the day. The men had no shade. Their lips cracked. Their skin burned. At night, the temperature dropped and they shivered in wet clothing. Thirst became the dominant sensation. The half-pint ration of water was barely enough. Men thought about water constantly. No one spoke much. There was nothing to say. The routine was established. Wake, receive ration, row or sail, wait, sleep. Repeat. The ocean remained empty. The boats moved east slowly. On good days with favorable wind, they covered 40 or 50 miles. On bad days, when the wind died or turned against them, they made 10, sometimes less. The men rowed in shifts, 2 or 3 at a time, while the others rested. The oars were heavy. Arms and backs ached. Hands blistered, then callous, then blistered again. Captain Pollard maintained strict control over the rations. Every morning, he measured out the hardtack, 3 ounces per man. It was a small piece, dense and dry, difficult to chew. The men softened it with seawater, letting it sit in their mouths until it broke down enough to swallow. It provided calories, but little satisfaction. Hunger was constant. Water was distributed twice a day, half a pint in the morning, half a pint at night. The men drank slowly, holding the water in their mouths to make it last. Some tried to save a portion for later, but discipline broke quickly under thirst. Most drank their full ration immediately. Owen Chase kept notes in his journal, though the entries grew shorter as time passed. He recorded their position each day when he could calculate it. He noted the weather. He noted the condition of the men. He did not write about fear or despair. The tone remained factual. The 3 boats stayed close. At night, they tied themselves together with rope, bow to stern, forming a small floating cluster. This prevented separation in the dark and allowed the men to communicate between boats. Captain Pollard's boat was in the lead. Chase's boat followed. Matthew Joy's boat brought up the rear. Joy was growing weaker. He had been unwell before the sinking, some minor illness that had not seemed serious at the time. But now, in the open boat with no shelter and limited food, his condition worsened. He did not complain. He continued to navigate and give orders to his crew, but the men in his boat could see him failing. Thirst was worse than hunger. The hardtack provided some relief to the stomach, even if it was inadequate, but the water ration was torture. The men were surrounded by water, endless water, and could drink none of it. Their tongues swelled. Their throats burned. Some men leaned over the side and wet their faces with seawater, but it provided no relief. Salt water only increased thirst. They saw no ships. The Central Pacific in 1820 was vast and largely uncharted. Whaling ships operated here, but they were scattered across thousands of square miles. The odds of encountering another vessel were minuscule. The men knew this. They did not discuss it. Rain came on the 8th day. A brief squall passed overhead in the late afternoon, and the men scrambled to catch the water. They spread out pieces of sailcloth, holding the edges up to form shallow basins. The rain pooled in the fabric, and they scooped it into their mouths, drinking as much as they could. Some filled containers. The rain lasted perhaps 15 minutes, then moved on. It was not enough to refill the water casks, but it helped. The men felt better that night than they had in days. But the improvement was temporary. The sun returned. The wind remained inconsistent. The boats continued east, but progress was slow. By the end of the second week, the men had traveled roughly 400 miles. They had 2,600 miles remaining. The rations were reduced. Captain Pollard recalculated the supplies and announced a change. 2 ounces of hardtack per day instead of 3. Water reduced to 1 pint total, split between morning and evening. The men accepted it without protest. They understood the necessity. Silence became normal. In the first days, there had been occasional conversation, small exchanges about the wind, the navigation, memories of home. But as the weeks passed, the men stopped talking. Speaking required energy. It increased thirst. There was nothing new to say. They sat in the boats and stared at the water, or at the sky, or at nothing. Chase noted the psychological weight of the routine. The ocean offered no variation. Each day was identical to the one before. The sun rose across the sky and set. The water moved in the same slow swells. There were no birds, no fish jumping, no whales, just emptiness. The mind had nothing to occupy itself. Time stretched. Some men slept for hours during the day, their bodies shutting down to conserve energy. Others could not sleep and simply sat, eyes open, unmoving. Pollard kept them rowing when possible, not for speed, but for discipline. The act of rowing provided structure. It gave the men something to do, a reason to focus. Without it, he feared they would drift mentally as much as physically. On December 20th, 30 days after the sinking, the lookout in Chase's boat saw something. A dark shape on the horizon, low and unmoving. At first, no one believed it, but as the boats drew closer, it became clear. Land. It was a small island, rocky, barren, with sparse vegetation and a thin beach. The men did not know its name. It appeared on no chart they carried, but it was solid ground. The boats turned toward it, and the men rowed with renewed energy, the first real effort in weeks. They reached the shore and dragged the boats onto sand. For the first time in a month, they stood on something that did not move. The island was roughly 5 miles long and less than a mile wide. The shoreline was coral and rock, sharp and uneven. Inland, low vegetation grew in patches. Small shrubs, grasses, scattered trees. The ground was dry. There were no streams visible, no obvious source of fresh water. But it was land. The men moved slowly. Their legs were weak from a month of sitting. Balance was difficult. Some stumbled as they walked up the beach. Their bodies had adapted to the motion of the boats. Solid ground felt unstable. They spread out and began searching. Food was the first priority. The island was home to seabirds, terns and boobies that nested in the rocks. The birds were unafraid of humans. The men walked up to them and killed them with their hands, twisting their necks or striking them with stones. Within an hour, they had collected dozens of birds. Fires were built from driftwood. The birds were roasted and eaten immediately, bones and all. It was the first fresh meat the men had tasted in over a month. Water was more difficult. The men searched the interior of the island, walking to the low brush and climbing over rocks. They found small pools and depressions where rainwater had collected, brackish and stagnant, but drinkable. One man discovered a spring near the center of the island, a weak trickle seeping from a crack in the rock. The flow was slow, but it was fresh water. They filled their containers and drank until their stomachs ached. For 3 days, the men rested. They ate birds and gathered eggs from nests. They found a type of pepper plant growing wild and ate the leaves. There were small crabs along the shore. The men caught and cooked them. It was not abundance, but it was far more than the rations they had been surviving on. Captain Pollard explored the island thoroughly. He walked its length and assessed its resources. The birds were plentiful now, but they were migratory. In a few weeks or months, they might leave. The spring provided water, but the flow was minimal, enough for a few men perhaps, but not 21. The vegetation was sparse. There was no large game, no fruit trees, no substantial food source that would sustain a large group indefinitely. The island had no name that the crew knew. It was isolated, far from any shipping route. No evidence of prior human habitation was found. No fire pits, no tools, no structures. If ships passed nearby, they did so rarely. Pollard gathered the men and presented the situation. The island could not support all of them for long. They had 3 options. All stay and hope for rescue, all leave and continue the voyage to South America, or split the group. The discussion was brief. Most men wanted to leave. The ocean had been terrible, but the island was uncertain. There was no guarantee of rescue. They could be stranded here for years. The boats, at least, offered movement. They offered the possibility of reaching a port, of controlling their own fate. But 3 men disagreed. William Wright, a black sailor from Barnstable, Massachusetts, said he would stay. Seth Weeks, a young man from Long Island, said the same. Thomas Chappell, another crewman, joined them. They preferred the island to the boats. They would take their chances with the birds and the spring. Pollard did not argue. The decision was theirs to make. The three men were given their share of supplies, a portion of the hardtack, a musket, some ammunition, a small amount of rope and sailcloth. They would live on the island and wait. The remaining 18 men prepared to leave. The boats were repaired. Seams were caulked with cloth and tar salvaged from the wreckage. The water casks were refilled from the spring. Additional birds were killed and stored in the boats. On the morning of December 27th, 1 week after arriving, the boats were launched again. The three men who stayed stood on the beach and watched. No one spoke. The boats pulled away from the shore, oars working, sails raised. Within an hour, the island was a dark line on the horizon. By afternoon, it was gone. The 18 men were alone again. The brief reprieve had restored some strength, but the ocean remained the same. The course remained the same. East toward South America. The distance, still over 2,000 miles. The routine resumed. Rationing, rowing, silence. But the men were changed. They had tasted something other than hardtack. They had felt solid ground. Returning to the boats was harder now. The confinement felt worse. The thirst returned immediately, sharper than before. Matthew Joy was visibly weaker. He could no longer navigate. One of his crew took over the sextant readings. Joy lay in the bottom of the boat, barely moving. He drank his ration of water, but could not eat. The hardtack was too difficult to chew. His body was shutting down. On January 10th, 1821, 3 weeks after leaving the island, Matthew Joy died. He had been sick for over 2 months. His body simply gave out. The men in his boat wrapped him in a piece of sailcloth and sewed it shut. They lowered him into the water. He sank immediately. There was no ceremony. The boat continued moving. The death shook the crew, though no one said so. Joy had been an experienced officer, a steady presence. His loss meant one less navigator, one less leader. The men understood what it meant. If Joy could die, any of them could. The next day, another man died. Richard Peterson, in Owen Chase's boat. He had been quiet for days, unresponsive. He stopped drinking water. Then he stopped moving. Chase checked him in the morning and found him dead. Peterson's body was sewn into his clothing, the same as Joy. But this time, the men hesitated. Chase wrote later that they discussed it, not openly, not in detail. But the idea was present. The body was meat. The men were starving. But no one spoke the thought aloud. Not yet. Peterson was lowered into the ocean. 2 men dead in 2 days. 16 men remained. The boats continued east. The wind was inconsistent. Some days they sailed. Other days they drifted. The men no longer had the strength to row for long periods. Their muscles had atrophied. Movement was slow, deliberate. Every action required thought. The rations had been reduced again. 1.5 ounces of hardtack per day. Water was rationed to 3/4 of a pint. The mathematics were simple. The supplies were running out faster than the distance was closing. The men knew this. They did not discuss it. Thirst became overwhelming. The men's tongues were swollen and cracked. Their throats closed. Swallowing was painful. Some men stopped speaking entirely, not from choice but from physical inability. Their lips split and bled. Salt from the sea air settled in the wounds. The pain was constant. Hunger was different. It was deep and hollow, an ache that filled the entire body. The men's stomachs had shrunk. When they ate their small ration of hardtack, it sat heavily, uncomfortable. But the sensation of hunger never left. Their bodies were consuming themselves, muscle tissue breaking down, fat reserves long since depleted. The men began to change physically. Their faces thinned, eyes sank into sockets. Skin pulled tight over bones. Ribs became visible. Joints protruded. They moved like old men, stiff and careful. Some developed sores that would not heal. Others had swelling in their legs and feet. Scurvy was setting in, though they did not name it. On January 12th, 2 days after Peterson's death, a storm separated the boats. It came in the night, sudden wind and high waves. The ropes that lashed the boats together were cut to prevent capsizing. Each boat fought the storm independently, bailing water, trying to keep the bow pointed into the waves. By morning, the storm had passed. Owen Chase's boat and Captain Pollard's boat found each other and came together. But Matthew Joy's boat, now commanded by a crew member named Obed Hendricks after Joy's death, was gone. They scanned the horizon. Nothing. They waited through the day, drifting, hoping to sight the third boat. It did not appear. Pollard made the decision to continue. They could not wait indefinitely. The missing boat had supplies, competent men, and a compass. If they had survived the storm, they would continue east. There was nothing more to be done. 2 boats now, 12 men total, 6 in each boat. The separation was a psychological blow. The small flotilla had stayed together for nearly 2 months. The presence of other men, other voices, had been a fragile comfort. Now half of that was gone. The ocean felt larger. Days blurred together. The sun rose and set. The men sat in the boats and endured. There was no conversation. Chase continued to take sextant readings when the sky was clear, calculating their position and their progress. They were moving east, but slowly. The wind was weak. The current worked against them in places. On January 20th, another man died in Chase's boat. Isaac Cole. He had been delirious for 2 days, muttering to himself, seeing things that were not there. Then he fell silent. By morning he was dead. His body was thin, emaciated. The men looked at him and then looked at each other. Chase did not write about what happened next in detail. He noted only that the body was not buried at sea. The men were starving. Cole's body was kept in the boat. They cut it apart. They removed the organs. They separated the limbs from the torso. They roasted pieces of flesh over a small fire built in a metal container in the boat. The smell was distinct. The men ate. There was no debate, no moral argument. The decision was made silently, collectively. The body was food. They consumed it over the course of several days. When it was gone, they felt stronger, not healthy, but functional. The protein sustained them. Chase wrote that the act was done out of necessity. He did not describe it as a choice. It was survival. The men did not speak about it afterward. They simply continued. In Pollard's boat, the situation was the same. Another man had died, Lawson Thomas. His body was kept. The men in Pollard's boat did the same as Chase's crew. They ate. The 2 boats were now operating under the same unspoken rule. The dead would sustain the living. It was not discussed between boats. Each crew arrived at the conclusion independently, but both understood. The act changed something. Not morally. None of the men had the energy for moral reflection. But practically, the bodies provided calories, real nutrition. For a brief period, the men's strength returned slightly. They could move more easily, think more clearly. But the bodies did not last long. Within a week, the meat was gone. The men were back to their rations of hardtack, now reduced to 1 ounce per day. The water was nearly depleted. Each man received half a pint, sometimes less. On January 28th, another man in Chase's boat died. He had been unconscious for a day. His name was not recorded clearly in Chase's journal. Some accounts suggest it was a young man named Charles Shorter. His body was processed the same way as Cole's. The men ate again. 3 men dead in Chase's boat since leaving the island. 3 men consumed. The crew in Chase's boat now numbered 3 survivors. Chase himself, Benjamin Lawrence, and Thomas Nickerson, the cabin boy who had been 14 when the voyage began. In Pollard's boat, the situation was worse. 4 men had died. The bodies had been consumed. But the deaths were coming faster now. The men who remained were too weak to function effectively. The boat drifted more than it sailed. The 2 boats lost contact again in early February. They had been sailing within sight of each other, but one night they drifted apart. By morning, each boat was alone. Chase's boat continued east. The 3 men aboard were skeletal. Nickerson, the youngest, was barely conscious. Lawrence rowed occasionally, but his strokes were weak. Chase navigated, though his calculations were becoming less reliable. His hands shook, his vision blurred. They had been at sea for nearly 3 months. They had traveled perhaps 1,500 miles. The coast of South America was still over 1,000 miles away. The ocean remained empty. No ships, No birds. No sign of life. Just water and sky, and the men waiting to die. Thomas's body lay in the bottom of Chase's boat for several hours before anyone moved. The men looked at it. They knew what had to be done. They had done it before. Chase took out his knife. The blade was dull, corroded by salt water, but functional. He began the work. Lawrence helped. Nickerson, the cabin boy, turned away. He was 16 now. Though he looked older, skeletal, hollow-eyed, his skin burned dark by the sun, he did not participate. But he did not object. The process was mechanical. The men had learned efficiency. They separated the limbs, removed what could be eaten, discarded what could not. A small fire was built in a metal pan. The flesh was cooked briefly, just enough to char the surface. Then it was divided. They ate slowly. Chewing was difficult. Their jaws ached. But the meat provided something the hardtack never could. Strength. Real, measurable energy. After eating, Chase felt his mind clear slightly. His hand steadied. The fog that had been settling over his thoughts lifted for a few hours. The body lasted 4 days. They rationed it carefully, consuming small portions each day. When it was gone, they returned to the hardtack. But the hardtack was nearly finished. Chase counted what remained. Perhaps a week's supply at the current ration. Maybe less. The water was worse. Less than 2 gallons remained in the cask. At half a pint per man per day. They had perhaps 3 days. After that, nothing. Chase did not write about fear in his journal. He wrote about calculations. Position, distance, wind direction. But between the lines, the reality was clear. They were not going to make it. The coast of South America was still too far. The supplies were gone. The men were dying. On February 8th, another man in Chase's boat became unresponsive. His name was not recorded in Chase's account, only that he was a crew member young who had stopped speaking days earlier. He lay in the bottom of the boat, eyes open but unseeing. His breathing was shallow. He died that night. The men waited until morning, then repeated the process. The body was consumed over the next 3 days. Chase, Lawrence, and Nickerson were now the only survivors in their boat. 3 men. The boat felt enormous with so few occupants. There was space to stretch out, but no comfort. The emptiness was worse than the crowding had been. Chase continued to navigate, though he was no longer certain of their position. The sextant readings were difficult to take. His hands trembled. The horizon wavered. He estimated they were perhaps 600 or 700 miles from the South American coast, but the estimate was rough. They could be farther. They could be closer. There was no way to know. The wind had died completely. The boat drifted. The sail hung slack. The men had no strength to row. They lay in the boat and waited. Nickerson was delirious. He muttered about home, about Nantucket, about his mother. He asked for water. Chase gave him a few drops. All that remained. Nickerson drank and closed his eyes. Lawrence was silent. He had not spoken in days. He sat upright, staring at the horizon, unmoving. Chase thought he might already be dead, but then Lawrence would shift slightly or blink, and Chase knew he was still alive. Chase himself felt detached. His body was failing, but his mind was still working, observing. He noted the sensations, the dryness in his throat, the ache in his limbs. The way time seemed to slow and then speed up without pattern. He wondered, distantly, how long it would take to die. Days, he thought. Maybe a week. On February 15th, 90 days after the Essex had sunk, Chase saw something, a shape on the horizon. He stared at it, unsure if it was real. Hallucinations had become common. Men saw islands, ships, birds, none of it real. But this shape remained. It did not fade. He watched it for an hour. It grew larger. It had sails. Chase tried to shout, but his voice was gone. He waved his arms weakly. Lawrence saw the ship too and tried to stand, but collapsed. Nickerson did not move. The ship came closer. It was a brig, under full sail, moving across their path. Chase pulled a piece of cloth from the boat and waved it. The ship altered course slightly. It was coming toward them. The brig pulled alongside. Men appeared at the rail, looking down. Chase heard voices, but could not make out the words. A boat was lowered. Men rowed over. They lifted Chase out first. His legs would not support him. He was carried aboard the brig and laid on the deck. Lawrence was brought up next, then Nickerson. The sailors stared at them. One man brought water. Chase drank a small amount, then vomited. The brig was the Indian, an English vessel out of London. The captain approached and asked questions. Chase tried to answer, but his voice was a whisper. He said the word Essex. He said, "Well." The captain nodded and ordered the men taken below. Chase, Lawrence, and Nickerson were placed in bunks. They were given broth, a few spoonfuls at a time. Their stomachs could not handle more. They slept. They had been at sea for 89 days since leaving Henderson Island, 93 days since the Essex sank. They had drifted over 1,500 miles. 3 men out of the 7 who had started in Chase's boat. But Pollard's boat was still out there. 6 men had been in that boat